Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, page 1267. Okay. So the Rebbe Rashab now is clearly moving the theme, the discussion and theme of Ayin Beis to another level. And I'll just put it in very practical terms, and then we'll go back to the actual language of the last paragraph that we learned yesterday. The question that he presented at the bottom of 1266, Achini Adayin Yesh Lahaven. So maybe in a type of visualization, a type of visualized way, remember the theme of Ayin Beis is interface. But it's not just an interface, because we're not dealing with two realities or two paradigms that have anything in common. You know, when an engineer has to interface between two circuits, or in any other scenario where you need to bring together two elements or two alloys or two, even if they're very different, but they both are creations and they both exist in the physical world and they both have many things in common. Even if you're talking about, can everybody mute? Can everybody mute? So even when you're talking about, let's say, energy and matter. So energy and matter, yes, they're two different forms, but they're two different forms, but they're both much in common. For example, when you turn a gas, can become a do you mind if everybody mutes, please, because there's some background noise? Okay. So if you take gas, liquid, and solid, so when you freeze water, it becomes ice. When you melt it, it becomes water. When you heat it, it becomes gas. So to the naked eye, it looks very different, but it's really three different forms of one element, of H2O, of water. Now, when you're dealing with Boira and Nivra, in every possible way, there's nothing in common, except that one created the other. But if you talk about infinite and finite, Mitzias built a Mitzias Nimtza, a non-existential type of existence and an existence as we understand it, and on and on and on. And yet is the Eibishter himself who created both the creation and the interface. So he did create something in common. He made something in common. Just like when we say a human being, different than every other creature, Hashem took Offer min Adama, dust from the earth. So there is from the earth, it's a created force, a created state, and Vayipar ba'apav nishmas chayim, and infused it with a breath of life from his own inner so-called elokus. Vayipar ba'apav nishmas chayim, and there you have an interface. Salmeinu kidmusenu, a human being created in the divine image. So an interface like this is a very complex and extensive, comprehensive process, because it's not just God can do whatever he wants, as I always point out, but he wants it to be in a way that we can also relate to it. That's where the dilemma is. The dilemma is God can do anything. He could just change the laws of nature. He could always suspend anything, but that's not the goal. The goal is dir b'tachtenim, and that we should understand it, and we should relate to it, and we should grow through all these steps. So hence, you need this whole process we call Torah and Mitzvahs, which is Chachmas and Ratzon Shel Kadosh Baruch Hu, and more specifically Pnimis HaTorah, and ultimately Chassidus, that gives us a blueprint, a methodology, tools to achieve this this bridge, this interface, this integration. Now, the reason I'm elaborating, you'll see in a moment. So overall, in the Ayin Beis themes from the beginning has been to how do we balance, how do we integrate the Makif and Pnimi, Eiris and Kalim, and ultimately before the Tzimtzum and after the Tzimtzum. And the same in all the levels of Ishtalshus, because every step of the way needs interface. It's not just a general one. Every step, just like when you talk about students and children, students and teachers, even if the teacher is creating an interface, every student is in their own particular a level of understanding. So you need an interface for each one, tailored to their needs. Everyone travels at their own pace. Everyone has their own unique kelim. So you have to account for all of that as well. So overall, one of the central places where things meet is Eidos and kelim, because Eidos represents so-called the divine identity. Think of the ideas on a page in a book, and the kelim are the letters on the page that express it, that contain it, that allow it to be channeled in a way that the makabel, the recipient, can understand it. If you have a page in a book and either there are no letters or there are no ideas, you have no interface. How can I communicate to you? You need to have oir, is the very idea, the concept. Kelim is the way it's communicated in a way that is effectively reaching its intended audience. And then, of course, you expand the kelim, just like going back to the best analogy for this is the student teacher. A student at 1 year old or 5 years old, 10 years old is not like at 40 years old. We're quite inishadai to the Rabbi, where a person reaches a level of expanded containers of their mind, and they can actually appreciate and really understand the depth of the ayin lires v'znaim l'shmoya, leiv. And both, as the Torah says, when the 40th year came, they had a deeper understanding on a qualitative level of what they had learned before. What is the language of Chassidus? The kelim have expanded to receive the Eidos. So in that context, okay, that's great. So you go step by step until the kelim can receive the highest level of Eir. But at the end of the day, as much as you expand the containers, you don't want to destroy them. You don't want them to explode. You want them to expand. But there's still structure, however you twist it. It's a very expanded structure. But to say it completely defies structure and completely left it all, you can't say that. If you say that, then you eliminate the very existence that God wanted a dira in, dira b'tachteinu. So what we've learned throughout Ayin Beis, especially till the end of volume 2, and now again, you see it emerging, was a lot about Havayu Hu Elikim. Yedaita Hayein, Vashavesa Levavecha, Ki Havayu Hu Elikim. B'Shamayim Mimal V'Oretz B'Tachas. That even though the creation came through Shem Elikim, but now you recognize Havayu Elikim, the divine within nature, within existence, and that's Oretz B'Tachas, and like Das Tachten. And then the Havayu Elikim of Shemayim Mimal, how even on the higher levels, the Havayu that is beyond existence. And so Elikim is now recognizing that. So even though Elikim represents Tzimtzum and concealment, but because we've expanded our containers and because of all the Avodah, we've come to a point where the Kelim and the Tzimtzum can receive an energy that initially was not able to be there. That's why you needed a Tzimtzum in the first place. Complete concealment. Then came a Kav, slowly spoon-feeding the student, step by step, as I've been explaining, climbing the ladder, or you could say these are the stepping stones. And now the Kelim are so expanded that they can receive Eir even before the Tzimtzum. But there's still something not accounted for. Is it a structure or is it no structure? If you say there's a structure, then you're really not reaching the highest levels that defy structure. We've been talking about Tainug Atzmi and so on. So yes, we've learned how you can reach there through Torah mitzvahs, through Avodah, through Mesiras Nefesh, B'chol Moedecha, Ava Rabba B'Tainugim, Simcha Shal Mitzvah. All of that contributed to expanding the containers, to first of all connecting to God, but connecting also with all the deep love, where it's Negei B'Nefesh, the highest levels of absorption, where we completely consumed with something greater than with godliness. But there's still you. Yes, you don't feel yourself. But the whole point is, like we said, that it shouldn't be just a rosh, it should be a shuv, that this whole experience should be infused, existence itself, with this higher experience. Correct, we don't feel it, it's all absorbed. But what do you do with the very existence after all this happens? With all the expansion, yes, Simcha Peretz Geder. Simcha Peretz Geder means it transcends, it breaks through all barriers. But are there any barriers left? Is there anything to talk about of structure or not? And The dira b'tachtena means there is a structure. So this is the last piece in the puzzle where the Rebbe Rashab is going to introduce Ein Oid. That's not just Havayu Elikim. That Elikim, the concealment, recognizes that the whole purpose of concealment is to reveal. And the whole revelation is in order to come into existence that where it is concealed. But the very concealment itself, the very Kalim themselves, not just as they are expanded to receive the air, they too carry a tremendous divine power, and as we'll learn, even a deeper power than the air itself. But all that cannot emerge until we go through the steps. There's no way to get there. You have to go through all these levels. So in essence, we could be saying the following, that we've discussed how we expand the parameters, the boundaries, through Simcha and all the other things we've learned. But what about the boundaries themselves? What happens to them? And that's why the way that Rebbe Rashab posed the question was, okay, he said we still have to understand where is Koyach HaSimcha Shal Mitzvah caused to go to Atzmus, and that there should be this Eir Rav Tuv Hatzofen the Gonus Ba'atzmus Mamish. At the end of the day, mitzvahs and Simcha Shal Mitzvah included are connected to Kalim. The 248 mitzvahs are rooted, as he said, in the 248 Evarim, the limbs, or you could say the divine organs or limbs, and they are Kalim of Esesrius of Atzilus, Chesed, Gvura, as he explained. So it's true, it's all one, but it's still Kalim. As he said, no matter, at the end of the day, Kalim are Magbila Sa'ir. Or else if you don't have that, you lose all structure. So you explained how we can expand it, but how do you account for that last piece? And then he continued that that's the Kav HaMidah. So fine, you've stretched the Kav HaMidah, which means the measuring rod that gave everything parameters and fundamental structure. So you've extended it, you've expanded it as much as possible, but you don't want to destroy existence. So as such, it's all al pi Kav HaMidah, Seder Ishtalshlus, through the Tzimtzumim, Kama Elamis, and all that. So then what exactly mitzvahs which are connected to these Kalim, Mawa Yisra and the mile of the mitzvahs, Ramachi Varim de Malka, which are Kalim Dezah. Considering the fact, so what exactly is happening? What are mitzvahs doing in this world of the Kalim when we already have established structure? So what do the mitzvahs do that's unique? The Eich Nemar, that through the mitzvahs, and how can you say that through the mitzvahs, Dafka, it increases in the source, Eirav Atzmi, meaning in the source that higher than this whole structure, and that should transmit into the areas of Kelim Atzilus all the way to the Gan Eden and Bria. And though we learned earlier that the Aveda is beside Etzma Neshama, Ava B'chol Moedecha, Ava Rabba B'tainugim. In other words, that's the Aveda that led us to a place that's completely beyond regular parameters. So he says, Harizeh Yifli Yeser. Because at the end of the day, the Neshamas are still Neshamas, and they're only a reflection of the containers. So even when the neshamas are in a state of this elevated state, but they still remain neshamas in this form of structure at the end of the day. And especially the neshamas not of Atzilus, of Biyah. And though the neshamas are rooted, all of the machshava, like he says, that this comes from the shadish, nevertheless, everything is still in some form of kalim. That's why there's a concept of neshamas. We're not destroying and eliminating the very nature of souls. You've just expanded them and allowed them to reach, and they, through their Aveda, have been able to reach these highest levels. So what we need to then explain and understand is the final piece. Fine, you've expanded the Kalim to receive air, but what happens with the Kalim at that point? Are they still... What is their identity like? And what we're going to learn is that the Kalim have a very particular root all the way in the Etzem that's even higher than Noir. So in addition to them being containers, like letters on the page that are channeling ideas, the very letters themselves have a divine power which is even higher than the Oir, which is of course a tremendous Chiddush, because you're talking now that the kalim, the very substance, the very structure itself, is itself. Now, just to show you the language, I want to bring you back to page, the first page in volume 3, 1207. So the Rebbe Rashab, I just want to read these words. They're very strong words. He says like this. When he asks, we now need to understand Ein Oid. Because after we said already, what are you adding Ein Oid? What does Ein Oid come to add? And the Rebbe Rashab says these words. Okay, after the whole page, closer to the bottom of the paragraph, he says the following words. But kol zeh, this gili of Shem Havaya and Elikim, kol zeh gili of Shem Havaya. This is all talking about the revelation of Havaya that's now entered even in the level of Tzimtzum.
Where are you holding?
I
On
said
the first page?
The first page of volume 3 in Ayin Beis, 1207. Through transforming the Tzimtzum, the Shem Elikim, Yegil Shem Havaya bebeis madregas hanal. So what is this all teaching us? That's a gili of Shem Havaya. However, now Havaya is also permeated and infused Elikim with that consciousness. Ach mashakosov ein oid, the next paragraph he says, that after the work is done, where everything has been separated and clarified and refined, Shem Elikim Atzmus, not just Shem Havaya is shining through the container or through the concealment, that the Shem Havaya itself will radiate. The Shem Elikim shu b'chinas helam, yeh b'chinas gilui. The helam will be gilui. Not just the helam will be a transparent channel for the gilui. It'll be kamoy Shem Havaya mamish. The night will radiate like day. And then he continues on to say that it'll even be higher. It'll even reach a higher level. Now, I refer you on page 1209. So on 1209, he says these words. That's not just the Shimu. He says like the Gilui is the oil, but not the Asius. It shines through the Asius, but not the Asius themselves. The Asius and Bechinas Helam. The only thing is, before the Tzimtzum, they were shining through the letters. He says in the middle of page 1209, the novelty or the chiddush, the innovation that will be in the future, the letters themselves will shine. Not just that they will not obscure and allow a seamless flow of the ideas to flow through the letters, but they themselves irradiate. That the very Helen will be Erve Gili. So these lines that I'm referring to are now going to begin to come alive and developed now where we are on page 60 pages later, 1267, in answering the question, what happens with these kalim? And ultimately, with all the power of mitzvahs and simcha shal mitzvah and all the ava b'chol meidecha and ava rabba b'tainugim and everything he described here, that at the end of the day, we have to understand what happens with the very structure itself, the kalim themselves. And that's what we're going to now start to answer in the middle, the new paragraph on page 1267. So the Rebbe Rashab continues now. And these pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this. Achine, however, the emes, in truth, yes, yisrin maila b'chinas hakelim ala eris. There's a yisrin maila, a quality, and an additional quality, an added quality. Yisrin means also not just an added, it means an advantageous quality, or in the level of kelim on eris. Because the sheirish hakelim kodum l'sheirish ha'eris. The root of the containers precedes the root of the eris. Now, this is a classic Chassidus Chabad approach to things. That on one level, one thing is higher than the next. But when you go to the root, it turns around. The thing that was lower is rooted in a higher place than the thing that was higher. So like in this case, Eris and Kalim. Everyone would say an Eris is higher than a Kali. You need Kalim, no one denies that. But a Kali comes like a body and a soul. Letters on a page and the ideas they convey. Energy and matter. However, when it comes to the Eibishter, he's not closer to energy than he is to matter. He's not closer to spirituality than he is to the material. So as we learn, and we have already learned, but now he's going to elaborate that material, or in this case, what we're calling kalim, are rooted higher than the root. The root of the containers are higher than the root of the earth. He doesn't say the keli is higher than the earth. He says the root of the keli is higher than the root of the earth. So, umeshum zeh, and because of this, yeshlem yisrein gam b'hishtalshlus. That's why even when they come into the structural schematics of Seder Shtalshlus, in other words, it's not just in the root. Also, as they come into the structure of things, they also will have something that is superior than the Eir. So this is an additional point, not just in the root, but also in actualization. And what is that? The binyan hachemer kodem lebinyan hatzura. That building the matter precedes building the building the form precedes building the function, essentially. The Gili ha'er, I'll explain what that means in a moment. The Gili ha'er hu al yedei ha'keli dafka. And the revelation of the Eir is dafka through the keli. Ulefi eifan ha'keli dafka. It's through the container and it's channeled in accordance to the container. It determines and defines how the Eir will manifest. U'kamoshn izboel le'il, dibra maskal al gimel dvarim. We learned in al gimel dvarim. This is in volume 2, page 1011. I have it here. Now, if I recall correctly, there's a long discussion about binyan hachemer and binyan hatzura. So when you look, for example, in the development of any birth and creation, what comes first, the body or the soul? So we know they come together, but you don't have a full-blown soul waiting for a body to catch up. What you first have is the one cell that was conceived through the fertilization of an egg by a seed, and the chaymer is building, and through that the tsura emerges as well. So let's look a moment in Aleph Yud Aleph, what he's referring to. There he discussed it, if I recall, very at length. Yeah. Iker binyan havlad, he says, umetipa se'em. And the same thing like when you plant a seed in the ground, first you have to plant the seed. You can't expect anything to grow without a seed. So you see from this that the kalim play a dominant role even in the shtalshlus. But this is going to be, we're going to explain this a little more at length. So let me just read first the opening sentences as the Rebbe Rasha begins to unpack this concept. Because now it comes by inyanhu. So what we've introduced right now, which is going to be elaborated upon, is that there's something about the kalim that the others do not have. So for a moment, let's think of it back to the example I gave with the words on a page in a book. So it's true, you could say the words are secondary to the ideas. The person who wants to write a book is not interested in writing words. He's interested in conveying ideas. He was ordered to transmit. He has an energy, an idea, a concept, whatever it is. The only way he can do it in this world is through containers. That's why he needs words and letters to communicate. Was anyone going to say that the words are more important than the ideas that they convey? And yet, here comes the big question. Since ideas, or in this case, Oyer, is not Keli, where'd they come from? Who created these Kelim? That's the question. So in the case of the Eibishter, they didn't come from nowhere. They didn't come from nowhere. Where did they come from? That the Eibishter, in his original plan, he envisioned that there'll be kelim. Yes, the kelim themselves are dormant, like empty letters. The oir is necessary to energize them and give them substance. And I say substance, I mean ideas. But the very kelim themselves are rooted in a place that precedes the oir itself. That's what we're going to understand what that means. And in context of what we're learning now, based on that, suddenly we're going to understand that kelim have something that the oir does not have. As much as the kelim expand to receive the oir, and that is absolutely necessary. Because without that, you don't climb all these levels of mutfa, murgish, muskal, the maturation process, the development of growing and expanding and experiencing higher states of emotional and cognitive maturity. But then there's the very kelim of the person or the entity, and that has its own track and route, as we're going to learn, in a deeper place than oir itself. And that is why, as he explained back in what I just read, page 1011 in volume 2, that the binyan havlad, the building, comes first in that sense. So it comes first both in the root and also in the actual structuring. I mean, in a sense, I don't know if I want to give the example of Betzalel and Aaron and Moshe as I first build the structure and then bring the vessels in. May not fit here, so I'm not going to bring that here. But that's briefly what he's saying without explanation yet. Now, this has been discussed earlier, but now, in this, especially in volume 3, in the context of Ein Oid, this is going to become a very critical component in the ultimate last step of how Achdus Hashem is not just in the kelim as they receive oir, but in the kelim themselves, and the very dynamics, the mysterious dynamics, I should say, of the Eibishter creating something that does not reflect himself. Remember, oir, its very quality is also something that is its limitation. What is its quality? That oir is gili. Its only identity is to reveal its source. Oir has no metzius of its own. As soon as you take away the source, the oir disappears. So the mila of that is that it introduces gilui, bittul, it introduces everything is godliness. But imagine oir and that's it. You'd never have tzimtzum, you'd never have kelim, you'd never have a world that we have. It would be like pure, undiluted energy, a field of energy, but it wouldn't fulfill the purpose. So on one hand, it's critical because it reminds us and allows us to have a taste and allows us to grow, to experience godliness. It's like you need the neshama because everything grows through the soul. But the very body itself, in this case, the kelim themselves, have something, a koyach atzmi, as we're going to call it, which we're going to learn is that a shimu, and those of you who've been following the classes I gave in a shimu, that's exactly the Rishimu. Where does the Rishimu come from? The Rishimu is Eishis and letters and Koyach HaGvul, Sheirish HaKelim, do not come from Ur, because Ur is a revelation. Kelim is a concealment. But concealment itself is a divine power. In the words of the Alter Rebbe and Shayach Vamun, Hein Hein Gvuresav. Just because Ur reveals and Helam conceals doesn't make it less of a divine power. And in many ways, like the simple example, for a wise person to be silent takes more energy to exercise that restraint than to speak. So if you think about it, from the recipient's point of view, Oyer is more pronounced, and Helam is concealment. I don't see anything. I don't feel anything. But from the point of view of the mashpia, where is more energy exerted? When he speaks or when he's silent? When he gives or when he withholds? So ultimately, the power of withholding, the power of restraint, the power of concealment, the power of gvul, and ultimately the power of the root of kelim is going to have an element that does not have. And when that is revealed, then the kelim themselves are revealing an inyan atzmi. Now, of course, we'll have to understand how that works together with the when they both come together and you have the best of both worlds. So obviously you'll have etzem begili. That's going to be the ultimate goal. So we've been talking mostly till now, about the kelim acclimating themselves and assimilating high levels of oyer, all the way to Ave B'Tainugim and Mechal Meidecha, and what he called the Siris Nefesh, where the person Abba ve'ima yichud, Abba ve'ima Eloyin, Zivug Shlim, gazing at Arich and Atik and absorbing Atzmus Ein Sof, the Tainug Atzmi of Atzmus Ein Sof. And now he's going to go back to the Kalim themselves and their role, as I've just been explaining. So I'll stop here for a moment for questions. And before I get into the Vihini Yadua, I'm sorry, not Vihini Yadua, Inyan Hu, and begins explaining this topic. If there are any
Rabbi
questions.
Jacobson, in the past, well, I think we brought this example, but I think Sefer Torah, it's the epitome of what you just talked about. That the or is the cloth, and then the keli is the words that are actually revealing, and the combination of what you're talking about. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I think the Sefer Torah is a perfect example of what you just described.
The word perfect is a very strong word. Since the Rebbe Rashab is not using this example, I wouldn't either. I can't really comment. I'm not sure if it's exactly this. I don't know which one is the kelim and which is the The cloth is what?
The cloth would be the or. The cloth would be the parchment would be the or, and then the words would be the keli. And so that's why you get the revelation.
An alternative example would be that the message of Torah, its ideas is the and the letters are the kelim. But you know what? This is, if it works for you, it works for you. I don't comment usually on something that I don't see how that necessarily helps us understand this. But to me, the is the message, and the kelim is right now the letters. That's how I would right now go about it. Once you speak about klaf, then what about the ideas themselves? The Torah's message that it's giving. Anochi Hashem Elokecha has a message. Isn't that
True, but also remember in the past we talked about the kelim having the chitzoni keli and the pnimi, so the outer and the inner.
This is exactly what I want to avoid. You're now, because you came up with a mashal, you're now using the mashal becomes more important than what he's saying here. And now you're explaining with pnimis and chitzenis. All that to me, it may be, maybe not. I don't know. He's not discussing it here. You've gone, your head is there, which is fine, but mine isn't, and the mimer is not talking about that. And I don't want to distract. So if it works for you, you feel this is the perfect way to understand this, God bless you. I'm not going to argue, but I don't want to start working and us, it's like negotiating against yourself. I'm going to start now negotiating with you about a mashal that you introduced. If the Rebbe Rashab said this mashal, then of course I would analyze it. But since not, I'm not sure whether this is the right mashal. Maybe you're going to, if you go down the road, you may find the mashal doesn't really work so well. So I didn't really apply myself. I mean, I hope you're not taking this in any critical way. I'm just, I like to learn very clearly. What are we learning? What are we not learning? I don't want to confuse matters.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Inyan Hu. Okay, the fourth line in paragraph 2 in 1267. And the inyan of this is the root and the source. Just a word about Sherish and Moker. In Chassidus, you'll find Sherish means a root, Moker means a source. Generally speaking, Moker is closer to the thing that it's a source to, and Sherish is a little more distant. Sometimes the expression like Ilis ha-ilos, Sibus ha-sibus. Ila is a cause, and Sib is a cause. But Sib is sometimes seen as more of a Sibba Recheka, like a distant cause, and Ila is a closer cause. Same thing, similar, Shemoka and Sherish. Moka means like an immediate source, and Sherish is more like a deeper rooted source. Just pointing out, it doesn't mean we could always be medayik exactly, because sometimes it's called a Shem HaNefel, sometimes synonymous words are used, and it's not necessarily something you have to go break and dissect. Even though I'm sure there's meaning in every time it's used, just wanted to point out in case you see the word Sherish Shemoka. Okay. So what is the root and source? He's starting with Netzalim, with Atzilus. What is the root, the source and root, the root and source, I should say? That where do Kalim, from whence do they come? The Kalim among the emanations. Because we don't just say there's Oyer HaChochma and Oyer HaBina and Oyer HaChesed. We say there's also Klei HaChochma, Klei HaBina, Klei HaChesed. So what's the Sheirish Makir? He says, Hu Bchinas Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof. The source for the Kalim is the core and essence of the divine. Baruch Hu. Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. And what about the Eir? V'Sheirish Makir Eiris, and the root and source of the energies Hanetzolim, Eiris Hanetzolim. The energies among the emanations, the Eir HaChacham, the Eir HaBina, Hu Mebchinas Ein Sof Bilvad. So he's now distinguished between Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof Baruch Hu and Ein Sof alone. Not that Ein Sof is some type of slouch and some small level, but it's not Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof. Okay, you're not going to often find this the way he distinguishes here, and he's going to explain what this means. But clearly, one is higher than the other. When you say Atzmus Umuhus, you mean something that's on a core level and not necessarily subject to revelation. When you say Ein Sof, it could be subject to revelation. So let's see how he's going to explain it. V'hine Yedua, and now it's known. The Toyer Ein Sof, Shaykh b'bchinas ha'er, lei b'bchinas ha'atzmus. When you say Ein Sof, no end, infinite, or Ein Sof would be no end, like bli gvul, without limit, but Ein Sof, it's the word he's using here. That you could say on Oyer, but not on Atzmus. Because he's going to explain in a minute why. Obviously, Atzmus is also, if Oyer is Ein Sof, Atzmus is for sure Ein Sof. But we're using a Toyar. When you talk about the Toyar, a description to say something does not have an end, you could say that on Oyer, but not on Atzmus, as he explains. Why? The Toyar Ein Sof, because the descriptive word called Ein Sof, it's the definition, Ein Sof, Shaykh Lema Bedover Sheyesh Shaykh Beireish V'Seif. If I'm going to say something does not have an end, you're saying it's possible this should have an end. It should have a beginning and an end, a reish and a seif. B'zeh Shaykh Lema She'en Le'Seif. And I'm telling you, no, this thing happens to does not have an end. You would never say it on something that's not subject to beginning and end. The Alter Rebbe says in Shaykhid V'Amunah, when you say you can't touch something with your hands, you say that on something that you're capable of touching. I could say that, let's say there's something now locked in a chest. I can't touch it because it's locked, but you're capable of touching. No person will ever say, I can't touch Seichel. It's the Alter Rebbe's mashal. Because Seichel is not subject to touch. You don't say on Seichel, it's not touchable. Why would you say such a thing? It's not in that realm. You could say Seichel, I don't understand. I do understand. In other words, the tool of touch doesn't apply there. So you don't say, I can't touch it. When you say something does not have an end, it's suggesting it's capable of having an end. It's in that realm, but it doesn't have an end. That's how he's explaining this toyar of Ein Sof. So on Atzmus, you have to use a different expression, not Ein Sof, as we'll see. V'hainu, the davar sheyesh le'tchila, which means something that has a beginning. Umamela yesh le'gam tichla. Therefore, it also has an end. Mitzad atzmei. He adds in the parentheses. What is he adding with that? Yeah, mitzad atzmei. In other words, on its own, it's if it has a beginning, it has an end. If it's not going to have an end, something else is forcing it to not have an end. But it's very parameter. Something that has a beginning has an end. Ukidua klal, as it's known, the axiom or the principle. What is the principle? The klal, the rule. The rule is a good word. The kol sheyesh le'tchila yesh le'tichla. That everything that has a beginning has an end. If a person, a human being, is born, there will be a point where they no longer will be here. Because that's the definition of existence within the world of finite parameters. What does that mean? The shaykh by tichel of a sof. She's a little subtle touch here that it's end and finite nature is applicable to this level because it has a beginning. In this domain where there's a beginning and an end, or it's applicable to say there's an end, there you can say, you know what, Ein Sof is unique, that even though it's in the realm where you can apply an end, it's Ein Sof. Now, why doesn't it have an end? Because the Eibishter doesn't want it to have an end. But it means it has in that world. The Commission Kosov, the Pelech Hariman. This is from a Makubal called Rameh Bepanoi, one of the Italian Kabbalists, who wrote a commentary on the Ramak's Pardes. So what does he write? The Chol Kadmen Nitzchi, everything that's primordial, everything that was here before everything else is automatically eternal. V'loi Kol Nitzchi Kadmen, but not everything that's eternal was always here. So in other words, the Eibishter could create something and give it nitzchias. Like we speak, for example, Tzva Hashamayim, the celestial bodies. We all know they have a beginning. They were created by God, but they were created in a way that they have a certain perpetual motion, perpetual energy. Ein Sof has a beginning. What's the beginning of Ein Sof? The Moer, the Mocker. The Eibishter created Ein Sof, but he created in a way that it should have no end. So the fact that it has no end is unique to it, but it definitely exists in the world of beginning and end because it has a beginning. So you could say that something that is Kadman, that was always here, is definitely will always be here, like Adain Alam Hoya Hoya V'yeh. But something that's always here does not mean it always was here. It could have had a beginning. That's what the Rameh writes, the Pelech Hariman. And therefore, Hagam sheyesh leitchila, and therefore, though Ein Sof has a beginning, v'shayich beireish, and you're capable of applying to the idea of a reish, a beginning, a head, a top. U'mekol mokem ein leisef. Nevertheless, it's possible to not have an end, like the Pelech Hariman just said. Like kol nitzchi, like kol kadmen nitzchi, but like kol nitzchi kadmen. So in other words, if something can have a beginning and no end, something that has no beginning automatically has no end. But that's not the word you would use for it, because Ein Sof suggests that it could have had a beginning. And that's why you'd never use that on Atzmus, because it could be confused with something that has a beginning and no end. Aval ba'atzmus, now he says, the Ein Lo Tchila, Atzmus that has no beginning, not like Oyer. The Ein Lo Tichla, and therefore also has no end. The Ein Shayach by Inyan Reish B'Seif Klal. There, you don't say Atzmus has no end and no beginning, because meaning no end, meaning as if it suggests that it's possible. It's not Shayach Reish B'Seif Klal. So Ein Shayach Lemer by Ein Sof. Therefore, the word the description Ein Sof is not applicable to such a state. Now, of course, this is all an elaboration that's going to help us understand the difference between Oyer being rooted in Ein Sof and Kalim being rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof. So it's very interesting how he's building it up, because we're going to come back and say, so 1 second exactly, Kalim are rooted in Ein Lo Tchila. Is that what we're going to be saying? Looks like it, right? But he's not finished yet, because we're getting into new territory here. I'll stop again if anybody wants any clarification.
I think when he's talking about Atzmus, Oyer, Ein Sof, he's not talking about Atzmus, he's talking about Oyer.
But he's comparing it to a level of Ein Sof. That's not Atzmus Ein Sof. Whenever Chassidus talks about Atzmus, it has to have some connection for us to speak about it. So generally, it's not Atzmus, but fine. Yeah. But he's definitely talking about two states here: Ein Sof, and what he said before, Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof Baruch Hu. He doesn't use the word Oyer, but it's definitely higher than Ein Sof, that generally speaking. But there's Etzema Oyer and so on. But we'll get there. You know, as I said many times, when the Chassidus wants to talk about Atzmus Mamish, it uses terms built to Mitzias Nimtza. It's a different type of language. Here, for all practical purposes, I have no problem saying there's Atzmus Ein Sof Baruch Hu, that's the Rebbe Rashab's words, and there's Ein Sof. So let's see how that's going to go. We'll see where he takes us with it. Another question? Okay. So I'll read a few more lines. Omnom, however, Masha'ir Nikre Ein Sof, now that we've established that Ein Sof is applicable to Ir, because it's in the realm of Reish and Seif and so on, whereas Atzmus is not in that realm altogether. So now he says, nevertheless, Masha'ir Nikre Ein Sof, when we say Ir is called Ein Sof, Ein HaKavona, Derak Ein Sof Lispashtuse. It doesn't just mean that it's Ein Sof like it begins here, but it extends endlessly. It means that in general it's Ein Sof. Because you could say the following: everything has a beginning, except of course Atzmus. God created different things. He created one thing that will only go, I'm just using a very physical example, will be 10 feet long. Another thing will be 100 feet long. And a third thing will be infinite long. The infinite set of numbers. It's a creation. Their beginnings all start from the same starting point, which is Atzmus, the creator. And yet he created some things with certain limits and some things unlimited. So you could say that's Oyer, Ein Sof Lispashtuse. So he says, no, it's more than that. It's Bechlolusu B'chinas Ein Sof. V'hainu, Shegam Behaschalose, Sheyesh Leitchila, also in the beginning, and it has a beginning. We know it has a beginning. Eina B'chinas Reish, V'kol ma shenimshach, U'mispashet Eina B'chinas Sof. Okay, that sounds pretty cryptic, right? So he says like this now. Let me just translate it, then we'll try to understand it. I think he's saying, I think in simple English, is that the Eir Ein Sof is not just a matter of quantity, that this is 10 feet long, this is 100 feet long, and Eir goes forever, but its very quality is an Ein Sof type of quality. He's not using those exact words, but he's saying that even Bas Chalosem, we know it has a tchila. What it means that it has a tchila, that it has a source, but it behaves in a way that is fundamentally not like a reish, the safe. That's what he's saying. So if you look at Eir Ein Sof, you wouldn't see, oh, here's its beginning, and it just shines endlessly. But rather, you would see that the Eir Ein Sof is a property of Ein Sof. Its whole identity is Ein Sof. Now, where he's going with this, we have to see, but that's what it sounds like he's saying. And this is what is written in Eitz Chaim. Because if you read the beginning of Eitz Chaim, the classic Eitz Chaim with Arizal is the first time presenting the Seder Tzimtzum. So what does he say? It had no beginning and no end, no top and no bottom. Based on what we just said, one second, it has a reish. And yet he says the Eir Sof has loy reish or loy safe. It means it filled the entire expanse in an infinite way, like we speak seamless field of divine energy. And that's why you need the tzimtzum to conceal it, to allow the kav. The kav absolutely has a mila and mata. The beginning of the kav, the end, the middle. So that's what it means. What does he mean by that? Or no, which means what? We just established that Eir Ein Sof is called Ein Sof because it's shayach. The concept of a beginning and an end is applicable to it because it has a root, it has a source. in the Atzmus, in the Eberst, the Creator. Nevertheless, its state of being is an Ein Sof type of state of being. It's not just, like I said, finite set of numbers, infinite set of numbers. This goes this long. It's not a quantitative difference. It's a qualitative. In other words, Ein Sof manifests the very concept of Ein Sof in every possible way. Even in its beginning, so even if you were able to visit, so to speak, and interview Ein Sof at its root, where it first originates from Atzmus, it wouldn't speak the language of a beginning. It would say, I manifest, the Eir does. All of Ein Sof of Atzmus, all of that infinite capacity, I have that. So in other words, it's not like saying the Eir has any limits. It's basically saying this Ein Sof has no limits. But it's still called Ein Sof because conceptually, it does have a source. So what he's adding here is not just that it has a beginning and no end, which is true, but its very personality is Ein Sof, but you still call it Ein Sof because it's not Ein Tchila, because in fact it does have a source. So in other words, the Tchila part is not because it limits the Eir, it's just stating a fact that the Eir is not Atzmus. It has a beginning in that sense. But for all practical purposes, since we're not talking in time and space, Eir carries Ein Sof properties. That's what he's adding here. And I've not seen this language. I think there may be in Samaches. Maybe there's a few places that the Rebbe Rashab goes in such depth into Ein Sof. But we're going to stop here because there's a lot more coming. But you see, he's building the case now for Ein Sof, the Sheidish Ha'er, and then he's going to go back to the root of the Kalim in Atzmus Ein Sof. That's where we're headed now, which is, of course, all coming back to explain this, the quality of Kalim themselves, not just as conduits and channels for Eir. The very pipes of Ishtalshos, the very Kalim, the Isis, and all that will be revealed as being a divine instrument as well. But that is another type of Avodah, which we're going to talk about, and comes after the Keli becomes a Keli to the Eir. Then what's revealed in the Keli is something that the Keli has that Eir does not have. But it has to be in that order. So we're going to stop here at the bottom of page 1267. Any comments, questions?
I have a question. Just terminology, because it seems it's very critical here to be very specific in distinguishing between Ein Sof and or Ein Sof. In fact, that seems to be what this whole, largely what this paragraph is about.
Ein Sof and Atzmus Ein Sof, not Ein Sof and Eir Ein Sof.
That's my question.
Well, look at the it says there's Sheidish Shemokar Eiris whom B'chinas Ein Sof, Sheidish Shemokar Makelim B'chinas Atzmus Muhus Ein Sof. That's, you're talking about that, or you're talking about Eir now? Not sure which line you want to refer to.
Well, that would you picked up on the essence of my question. I guess when we refer to Ein Sof, I mean, I was distinguishing between or Ein Sof and Ein Sof. Ein Sof meaning that is a name for God, and it says Atzmus Umuhus Ein Sof. You're saying the essence of Ein Sof, but that, I mean, Atzmus is the essence of Ein Sof. Ein Sof, let's say, is that which has no beginning and no end. Or Ein Sof has a beginning but no end. No?
He gave a whole section now that the description Ein Sof is not applicable to Atzmus, only to Eir. Just explain that length. Why?
Well, that was my question. I wanted to clarify.
The whole section we just learned is answering that question. It's not a question. This is what he came to explain. He just explained, because Ein Sof does not necessarily mean Ein Tchila. I think you should just read it again.
I will. No, I will.
Yeah.
No, I get the concepts. I just trying to figure out which terms to apply to which.
Well, so what's your question now? What are you asking?
The distinction between or and
let's just read together inside. He says like this. He says like this. The Toyer Ein Sof Shayach b'chinas Eir le b'chinas Atzmus. that clear?
Which line is it?
The sixth line from the top of the paragraph.
Oh, uh-huh.
You see that?
The Torah Ein Sof Shaykh B'chinas Ha'or L'B'chinas Ha'atzmus. Torah
There
Ein
you
Sof
go.
Shaykh B'chinas Ha'or.
And then he continues to explain why. Because you can
Okay.
only say Ein Sof in a realm where Sof is possible. And by Atzmus, you don't,
I
Sof is
see.
not possible.
Got it. Now I got it. Now I got it. That was what I was missing. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Any other? If not, we'll stop here.